healthy and beautiful, and in the end we don't achieve anything. We're none of those things, right? But some people are truly single-minded, and so they pursue those goals and they achieve them, okay? Okay, let's talk now about systems of ethics, theories of ethics. That's the last concept I want to mention in this session. Different ethical theories. What is the origin of morality? On what do we base this notion of what is right and what is wrong? I offered you a theory, a widely accepted theory, which is natural law. And I said that natural law requires the belief in a God or in a supernatural order. Why is that? Well, how could otherwise morality be objective and universal? How could you say that there is an objective right and wrong for things unless that has been decided by some higher being, some higher power, who has determined that this is right and that is wrong, regardless of how you feel and how anyone feels? Unless you posit that the existence of that higher power, there is no way to say that morality is objective. There is a right and a wrong, objectively speaking. There are attempts to mimic natural law on a secular level. Let me explain what I mean by secular. Secular. The word secular comes from Latin seculum. The word seculum in Latin means century, and it could translate better for us as fashion. Now, in the church, in today's Catholic Church, but in the old church, which is what we today call the Catholic Church, before any separations took place, there are two kinds of clergy. There is the regular clergy, regular, and regular comes from regula, which means in Latin means a ruler that you use to draw a straight line, a ruler. Okay? And so those clergy, monks and nuns, live by a rule. They get up at the same time, then they pray, then they work, then they have lunch, then they pray again, then they work. And they do the same thing every single day. Their life goes by a rule, by a regula, by a ruler. Okay? That's regular clergy. And then you had like parish priests. They take care of parishes, they're priests, but they don't have to live by a rule. They can go with a fashion. They don't have to dress in the same way as monks and nuns do, but they can just dress any way they want, the way regular people dress, and fashion changes. And those parish priests are still called secular clergy. But the word secular, by extension, has come to mean simply anyone who is not religious. It does not necessarily mean anti-religious, okay? But simply outside the scope of religion, okay? So there is this secular version of natural law. I'm going to give you one particular example, okay? Which is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That list of 30 rights approved by the UN General Assembly are really a non-religious form of natural law. Not God, but the UN Assembly says these 30 rights apply to everyone, everywhere in the world. And if you personally, or your country, your culture, your laws, your customs, your upbringing, whatever, disagree with this, you, your country, your traditions, your culture are wrong. Well, that's pretty much the same as natural law, okay? Right and wrong are fixed objective, and if you disagree, or your country or your traditions, your country, your traditions, your culture are wrong. In this case, it's the UN who says that. Well, it's the same. It's really a natural law-like moral legislation, really, because that's the UN makes moral legislation more than actual legislation. But in this case, the origin of those laws is not based on this intuitive knowledge that must have been placed in us by God, but simply on the UN General Assembly saying so. Okay, so natural law. There have been attempts to justify morality on rational grounds. There are two systems of theories that are philosophical, based on reason, and these are consequentialist theories, also called teleological, the best known of which is called utilitarianism. And deontological theories. We associate the names of Jeremy Bentham, 18th and 19th century British philosopher of the Enlightenment, and John Stuart Mill, a 19th century philosopher, British philosopher too, also kind of a late phase of the Enlightenment, already 19th century, but still with the same kind of enlightened ideas. And deontological theories are mostly associated with Immanuel Kant, okay? The German philosopher, 18th and early 19th century. He died in 1804. Consequentialist theories look at the consequences of your actions. The idea being that if the consequences, the results, or the goals that you pursue are good, then your actions are morally justified. In other words, I'm sure you've heard this principle that the ends justify the means, right? There are many versions of this type of theories. Utilitarianism is one of them, and there are many versions of utilitarianism, not just one. But the general principle in utilitarian philosophy is that we should pursue what will bring the greatest good for the greatest number. Utility, that's what's called utilitarianism, is understood as that which brings us happiness. And it's mostly understood in a more, not in a gross sense as in hedonistic pleasure, but more of an intellectual, intellectual plane, okay? In a more subtle way of intellectual and emotional happiness. What is the problem with utilitarianism? Well, if we pursue that which brings the greatest good for the greatest number, we may as well justify slavery, because we just enslave small group within society, and that will definitely save us a lot of money. It'll bring a lot of good for the greatest number in society. We don't want to justify that. Deontological theories are duty-based theories. This means duty. It comes from the word duty. And what that means is it's in the nature of the act to be we do regardless of the consequences, that we have to judge whether the action is morally justified or not. So regardless of the consequences, whatever we do has to be morally justified. We can only pursue good ends by moral means. We cannot pursue good ends by the wrong means. But of course the problem is what is right in itself, that in itself is an issue. We can't get into that here because we're not doing ethical theory, but Kant has his own answer to that, okay? Something which can be universalized, that anyone in your situation would want to do. So we don't need to get into that now, but that in itself brings another problem as to what is right and what is wrong, okay? Some colleges do not offer courses in ethics as such, but only on deontology, professional deontology. In other words, consequentialist or teleological ethics are not considered moral because they look at only at ends, goals. It has to be a deontological approach, and that is what is considered truly moral, okay? Do you have any questions so far? Or any questions at all? Okay, well, this concludes our first class, our first session. Thank you.